Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is Sacagawea. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. There is a woman on every piece of currency in circulation whose name most Americans know and whose story most do not. She appears on the golden dollar coin, introduced in 2000, a young woman in profile, her dark hair pulled back, a baby visible on her back, her gaze directed forward and slightly upward towards something the viewer cannot see. Her name is Sacagawea. She was Shoshone, born somewhere around 1788 or 1789 in the foothills of what is now Idaho, near the Lemhi Pass that crosses the Continental Divide. She was captured by Hidatsa raiders at around the age of 12, taken hundreds of miles from her homeland, and sold or traded to a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who took her as one of his wives when she was perhaps 14 years old. At the age of 16, pregnant with her first child, she was hired, along with her husband, to join the Lewis and Clark expedition as an interpreter. She traveled more than 8,000 miles in less than 2 years, carried a newborn baby through the worst conditions the American continent could offer, translated between languages that no other member of the expedition understood, and helped guide the corps of discovery through mountain passes and river systems that would have stopped them without her knowledge. When the expedition returned to St. Louis in 1806, Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal that she had been of great service to the expedition and had shown remarkable fortitude throughout. Then she disappeared from the historical record. What happened to her next, and what happened to her in the years before the expedition, in the years of her childhood and her captivity, is a story that the history books rarely tell with the fullness it deserves. It is a story of a world that was both more complex and more beautiful than the simple narrative of exploration suggests. It is a story of a girl who was extraordinary in ways that the men around her only partially understood, moving through a landscape she knew in her bones, doing work that no one else could do, and receiving, for most of her life, very little credit for it. This is her story, or as much of it as history has preserved, and in the gaps where history falls silent, we will fill in the world around her with the facts and the landscapes and the peoples that she knew. Breathe slowly. Let your body settle. We are going back to the mountains of Idaho in the late 18th century, before everything changed. The Lemhi Shoshone are a people of the mountains and the river valleys, their homeland centered on the Lemhi River and its tributaries in what is now east-central Idaho, at the base of the Bitterroot Range and just west of the Continental Divide. They have lived in this landscape since before recorded history, since before any European concept of history reached this part of the world, moving through it with the seasonal rhythm that the land required, up into the mountains in summer, to hunt elk and bighorn sheep, and to gather the camas bulbs and service berries and chokecherries that would be dried and stored for winter, down to the sheltered river valleys in the cold months, where the canyon walls blocked the worst of the wind and the cottonwood groves provided firewood and the rivers ran open long into December. The Lemhi Shoshone are part of the larger Shoshone-Bannock cultural and linguistic family, which occupies a territory stretching from southern Idaho through Nevada and Utah and into Wyoming. The Shoshone language belongs to the Numic branch of the Uto-Aztecan language family, a language group that also includes Comanche, a dialect of Shoshone, Paiute, and Ute. The Shoshone-Bannock peoples had inhabited the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain region for at least 10,000 years before European contact, developing sophisticated adaptations to one of the most varied and demanding environments on the continent. The Lemhi Shoshone of the late 18th century were not horse-rich. The horse had reached some Shoshone groups by the early 1700s, moving north and east from the Spanish settlements in New Mexico, but the Lemhi bands, living in the mountains, not the plains, had fewer horses than the plains tribes and relied more heavily on foot travel, on dogs as pack animals, and on the intimate knowledge of the mountain landscape that allowed them to move efficiently through terrain that would exhaust or lose people who didn't know it. They were skilled hunters, especially of salmon. The Lemhi River and its tributaries ran with Pacific salmon every summer. Chinook salmon, sockeye salmon, fighting their way hundreds of miles inland from the Pacific Ocean, up the Snake River and the Salmon River and the Lemhi. Their bodies, changing from silver blue ocean fish to deep red spawning fish as they traveled, arriving in the mountain streams exhausted and transformed and present in such numbers that a skilled fisherman could take dozens in a single day. Pacific salmon spawning runs in the inland rivers of Idaho were, before the construction of hydroelectric dams in the 20th century, one of the great natural phenomena of North America. Chinook salmon, the largest Pacific salmon species, averaging 15 to 40 pounds and reaching up to 120 pounds, traveled up to 900 miles from the Pacific Ocean to spawn in the headwater streams of Idaho. The Lemhi Shoshone built weirs, fish traps of woven branches and stakes, across the smaller streams to intercept the salmon, taking them in vast quantities during the late summer runs and drying the flesh for winter food. A successful salmon season could provide the primary protein source for an entire winter. This was the world into which Sacagawea was born in approximately 1788 or 1789. The exact year is uncertain. The Lemhi Shoshone did not record births in the European fashion, and the first historical mention of Sacagawea comes from the Lewis and Clark journals in 1804, when she is described as approximately 16 years old, which places her birth somewhere in the late 1780s. Her Shoshone name, the name she was born with and carried through her childhood, is not definitively known. The name Sacagawea, by which she is known to history, is almost certainly not her birth name, but a name given to her later, perhaps by the Hidatsa people who captured her, perhaps by the expedition members who worked with her. The name has two competing etymologies. In Hidatsa, it translates roughly as bird woman. In Shoshone, a similar-sounding name translates as boat launcher or boat pusher. The bird woman interpretation is the one that has endured in popular memory. It is for a woman who spent her life moving, across mountains, across plains, across rivers, through the most geographically varied country on the continent, perhaps fitting. Birds know the shape of the land from above. They navigate by landmarks that ground-bound creatures cannot see. They carry their whole world with them. Try to imagine her childhood. Not the childhood of the historical figure, not the woman on the coin, already weighted with the significance that history would assign to her, but simply the childhood of a girl growing up in the Lemhi River Valley in the last decade of the 18th century. The mountains around her were the Bitterroots to the east and the Salmon River Mountains to the south and the Lemhi Range to the west, a complex of peaks and ridges and deep river canyons that enclosed the Lemhi Valley like cupped hands. The valley floor was perhaps 15 miles long and 2 or 3 miles wide at its broadest, the Lemhi River running through it clear and cold, lined with cottonwood and willow, the slopes above the valley covered in sagebrush and bunchgrass, that gave way at higher elevation to forests of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. The Lemhi Valley sits at an elevation of approximately 4,500 to 5,000 feet, with the surrounding peaks rising to 10,000 feet or more. The climate is one of the most variable in the American West. Warm and dry in summer, with temperatures reaching the 80s and 90s. Brutally cold in winter, with temperatures regularly dropping below zero and snowpack in the mountains, lasting well into spring. The growing season is short, perhaps 60 to 80 days at valley bottom, which made the storage of dried salmon, berries and roots absolutely critical to winter survival. She would have learned from earliest childhood the things that a Lemhi Shoshone girl needed to know. How to gather camas bulbs, the starchy onion-like roots of the blue camas lily that grew in the mountain meadows and formed one of the dietary staples of the region, and how to distinguish them from the white camas, or death camas, which grew alongside them and was lethally poisonous. This distinction was not academic. The two plants looked very similar, especially before flowering, and a mistake could kill. The knowledge was passed from mother to daughter with the precision of something that mattered absolutely. She would have learned how to dry salmon, how to split the fish along the backbone, remove the bones, and hang the flesh on willow frames, in the sun and wind to dry into the pinkish-orange strips that could be stored through the winter. She would have learned how to process service berries and choke cherries, how to dry them, how to pound them with dried meat and rendered fat, into pemmican, the compact, calorie-dense food that could sustain a person through days of hard travel when nothing else was available. She would have learned the geography of her homeland with the precision that survival required. Not as abstract map knowledge, as sensory knowledge, the kind that lives in the body. The sound the Limhai River made at the crossing near the winter camp, different from the sound it made 2 miles downstream. The particular smell of the high meadows above the timberline in July, when the wildflowers were at peak and the air was thin and cold even in midsummer. The way the light fell on the bitterroots in late afternoon, turning the rocky faces from grey to amber to rust in the space of an hour. She would have known, as all Lemhi Shoshone children knew, the stories of the people, the creation stories, the stories of Coyote the trickster, the stories of how the world came to be as it was and how the people came to be who they were. These stories were not separate from knowledge. They were a form of knowledge, a way of encoding the accumulated wisdom of generations about the land and the weather and the behavior of animals and the proper way to move through the world. She was perhaps 11 or 12 years old when everything she knew was taken from her. The date is uncertain. The date is. The accounts that survive, primarily what Sacagawea told members of the Lewis and Clark expedition years later, as recorded in the journals, describe an attack on a Lemhi Shoshone camp near the Three Forks of the Missouri River, where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers converge in what is now southwestern Montana. The Lemhi Shoshone had traveled east over the Continental Divide to hunt bison on the plains, a journey they made periodically, crossing the mountains through passes they knew well, descending into the open country where the great bison herds grazed. It was a dangerous journey, not primarily because of the terrain, but because the plains east of the divide were the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Hidatsa, both of whom were more numerous and better armed than the mountain Shoshone, and both of whom conducted raids on the Shoshone when the opportunity arose. The Hidatsa were a semi-sedentary people of the upper Missouri River, living in permanent earth lodge villages near the confluence of the Knife and Missouri rivers in what is now North Dakota. They were sophisticated traders, farmers, and warriors who conducted long-distance raids for horses and captives across a wide area. Unlike the fully nomadic plains tribes, the Hidatsa grew corn, squash, and beans in large gardens and traded agricultural produce for bison robes and other goods with the hunting peoples around them. Their earth lodge villages were among the largest and most prosperous communities on the northern Great Plains. The raid, when it came, was sudden. The Hidatsa attacked the Shoshone camp, and in the chaos that followed, people running in every direction, the sound of gunfire and screaming, horses rearing and pulling at their ropes, several Shoshone were killed, and several others, including Sacagawea and at least one other girl, were captured. She later told members of the Lewis and Clark expedition that she had tried to cross the river to escape. She was caught in the water. She was, at that moment, perhaps 12 years old. The Hidatsa raiders took their captives back to their villages, hundreds of miles away across the plains. The journey would have taken weeks, on foot or on horseback, moving east across the mixed grass prairie of Montana, crossing the Yellowstone River, descending the Missouri. The landscape changed around the captive girl with every mile, from the mountains she had known all her life, to the rolling hills of the Missouri Breaks, to the broad flat floodplain of the Missouri near the Hidatsa villages. She had never seen a place so flat. She had never been so far from the mountains. The Hidatsa called her Sacagawea, Birdwoman. Whether this was a personal name or a descriptive term, whether it referred to something in her manner or her appearance, or was simply a name given to a captive to replace the one they did not know, is uncertain. It is the name that history kept. She spent the next several years in the Hidatsa villages. The accounts are sparse on this period. We know she was there. We know she learned the Hidatsa language, which she later used as one of the primary links in the translation chain of the expedition. And we know that she eventually came into the possession of Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper who had been living among the Hidatsa for years and who took her as one of his wives. Charbonneau is a complicated figure and an important one, because his limitations are part of what makes Sacagawea's contributions to the expedition so clear. He was experienced in the fur trade, spoke French and some English and the Hidatsa language, and had enough wilderness knowledge to be useful in the upper Missouri country where he had spent years. He was also, by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew him, difficult, prone to cowardice in dangerous situations, quick to anger, sometimes violent, and inclined to overestimate his own abilities. Toussaint Charbonneau, c. 1767-1843, was born in Quebec and came to the American West as a young man, first working for the Northwest Company and then settling among the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples. He had at least 2 Shoshone wives, Sacagawea and another young woman named Otter Woman, both of whom he had obtained through gambling or trade with Hidatsa men. He is believed to have purchased Sacagawea from a Hidatsa man who had won her in a gambling game. He was approximately 40 years old when the Lewis and Clark expedition hired him. Sacagawea was approximately 16. Charbonneau's purchase or acquisition of Sacagawea, the exact mechanism is unclear, and the historical accounts vary, placed her in a situation that was, by any modern measure, one of profound vulnerability. She was a captive, far from her homeland, married to a man decades older than her, with no family and no community of her own. She spoke the Hidatsa language she had learned in captivity and retained her native Shoshone. She was, as far as the historical record shows, utterly alone. What she felt during these years, what she thought, how she understood her situation, these things are not recorded. The Hidatsa women around her would have been her primary human contact, and the relationships she formed in those years, the language she absorbed, the customs she learned, the particular way of moving through a village life that was very different from the mountain life of her childhood, all of these prepared her for the role she would play, unexpectedly and improbably, beginning in the winter of 1804. She was, in the autumn of that year, approximately 16 years old and heavily pregnant with her first child when 2 American captains arrived at the Hidatsa villages and began asking questions. "Your breath is settling. We are moving toward the river now, toward the Missouri in the autumn of 1804, toward the moment when one girl's life became part of the largest journey in American history." The Corps of Discovery arrived at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in late October of 1804, after 5.5 months of travel up the Missouri River from their starting point near St. Louis. They had traveled approximately 1,600 miles. They had approximately 3,700 more to go to reach the Pacific Ocean. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages, 5 villages in total, clustered near the confluence of the Knife and Missouri rivers in what is now central North Dakota, were among the largest and most prosperous communities on the northern Great Plains. Approximately 4,000 people lived there, Mandan in 2 villages, Hidatsa in 3. They were farmers and traders, their Earth Lodge villages the commercial center of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. The Mandan Earth Lodge villages were remarkable architectural achievements. Each lodge was a circular structure, typically 40 to 60 feet in diameter, built over a shallow excavation with a framework of large cottonwood timbers covered in smaller branches, grass, and a thick layer of earth. They were warm in winter, cool in summer, and large enough to house an extended family of 10 to 20 people along with their horses, which were brought inside during particularly cold weather. The lodges lasted 20 to 30 years before needing replacement and were arranged in clusters with open plazas for communal activities. Lewis and Clark built a fort, Fort Mandan, across the river from the villages and settled in for the winter. They had planned to spend the winter there regardless, as travel on the Missouri was impossible once it froze, and the villages offered the intelligence they needed. Information about the geography of the country to the west, the location of the Rocky Mountains, the nature of the peoples they would encounter. They also needed an interpreter. The country between the Mandan villages and the Pacific was largely unknown to the expedition. Their maps were crude, based on second-hand accounts and native geographical knowledge passed along through multiple intermediaries. What they knew was this: somewhere to the west were the Rocky Mountains, and on the other side of the mountains, rivers ran to the Pacific. To find the mountain passes, they needed guides. To communicate with the peoples of the mountain country, they needed someone who spoke the mountain languages. In the Hidatsa villages, they found Toussaint Charbonneau, who had Shoshone wives. Charbonneau came to Lewis and Clark in November of 1804 and offered his services as an interpreter. He spoke Hidatsa and French. Through his wives, he had access to Shoshone. The captains recognized immediately that this was significant. The Shoshone, whose homeland was near the headwaters of the Missouri, were the people from whom they would need to obtain horses to cross the mountains. Without horses, crossing the Rockies was impossible. Without the Shoshone, obtaining horses was nearly impossible. Without someone who spoke Shoshone, communicating with the Shoshone was nearly impossible. They hired Charbonneau. They also, critically, specified that his Shoshone wife would accompany him. Lewis and Clark's journals make clear that Sacagawea's ability to speak Shoshone was the primary reason for including her in the expedition. The translation chain they envisioned worked as follows. Sacagawea would translate from Shoshone into Hidatsa. Charbonneau would translate from Hidatsa into French. A member of the expedition named Private François Labiche, who spoke French and English, would translate into English for the captains. This four-language chain, Shoshone to Hidatsa to French to English, was slow and cumbersome and prone to errors of translation and interpretation at every link. But it was the only chain available, and it worked. She was approximately 16 years old. She was in the final months of her first pregnancy. She had been living away from her homeland for 4 or 5 years. She was about to travel more than 3,000 miles in one direction, and then 3,000 miles back, carrying her baby the entire way. Whether she was asked, whether she was told, whether she had any choice in the matter, the historical record does not say. Charbonneau was hired, and Sacagawea came with him. This is how the journals record it. What the journals do not record, because the men who wrote them were not equipped to see it or value it, was everything she brought with her that had nothing to do with language. The knowledge of the mountain, country she had been taken from. The Shoshone understanding of the landscape that she carried in her memory from childhood. The skills, in gathering, in food preparation, in navigation by natural landmarks, that would prove, over and over in the months ahead, to be the difference between the expedition succeeding and failing. In the journals, she is mentioned, infrequently at first. She is the squaw. She is Charbonneau's wife. Her name appears inconsistently, sometimes Sacagawea, sometimes Janie, Clark's informal nickname for her, sometimes simply the interpreter's wife. She was carrying the future of the expedition in her knowledge and her memory, and she was 8 months pregnant, and the temperature at Fort Mandan that winter dropped to 45 degrees below zero. On the evening of February 11th, 1805, Sacagawea went into labor. The labor was long and difficult. The journal entry by Meriwether Lewis the following day describes the situation with the clinical attention of a man who was also a trained physician. She had been in labor for a considerable time with violent and protracted pains, and the birth was not progressing. A French trapper named René Gessome, who had lived with the Mandan for years and knew their medicines, suggested a remedy he had seen used before, a portion of the rattle of a rattlesnake crushed and dissolved in a small amount of water given to the laboring woman. Lewis was skeptical, but agreed to try it. Within minutes of drinking the rattlesnake rattle water, Sacagawea delivered her son. Whether the rattlesnake rattle had any actual pharmacological effect on Sacagawea's labor is unknown and unlikely. There is no known mechanism by which rattlesnake rattle could affect uterine contractions. Lewis himself noted in his journal that he was not certain the remedy had worked, or whether the timing was coincidental. The most probable explanation is that the labor had progressed to the point of delivery regardless, and the rattle simply happened to precede the birth. But Lewis noted the incident as remarkable, and it has been remembered ever since. The baby was a boy. Sacagawea named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, the French name his father gave him. But Clark, who became deeply fond of the boy, called him Pomp, or Pompey, a nickname from a classical story that the well-read Clark might have associated with the boy's regal bearing or commanding personality even as a newborn. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was born at Fort Mandan, North Dakota, in the middle of one of the harshest winters on the northern plains. He was born to a 16-year-old Shoshone captive in a small military outpost on the frozen Missouri River, surrounded by American soldiers and French traders and Mandan visitors and the 45-below cold of a continental winter. 2 months. Later, when the ice broke and the expedition pushed west, he went with them, on his mother's back in a cradleboard, the traditional Shoshone and Plains child carrier. A flat board with a protective hood and wrapped bindings that held the baby securely against the mother's back, keeping his hands and face warm and his spine properly supported while she moved. He was the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery. He was 55 days old. On April 7, 1805, the expedition left Fort Mandan and headed west into country that no American had mapped. There were 33 people in the party. Lewis and Clark, 26 soldiers and civilians, Clark's enslaved, Servant York, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and Jean-Baptiste. They traveled in 2 dugout canoes and 6 smaller pirogues. The boats loaded with the supplies and scientific equipment and trade goods and weapons that the expedition would need for the next year and a half. The Lewis and Clark expedition was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily well equipped for a scientific journey. The supply manifest included 193 pounds of portable soup, a dried concentrated meat soup that could be reconstituted with hot water, 30 gallons of whiskey, 600 pounds of lard, approximately 3,500 rifle flints, 15 prototype air rifles, an advanced repeating weapon that could fire 20 shots without reloading, powered by a hand pump, which impressed and intimidated native peoples who encountered it, astronomical instruments including sextants and chronometers for precise navigation, a library of medical texts and botanical references, and an extensive collection of trade goods including glass beads, mirrors, knives, and medals bearing the portrait of President Jefferson. The Missouri River, in April, was running fast and cold with snowmelt, the current strong against the loaded boats. The men at the oars worked hard, and where the river bent against cliffs or the current ran too strong to row against, they took to the shore and pulled the boats with ropes, wading through the frigid water and the muddy banks, straining against the weight. Sacagawea walked. She walked along the shore when the boats moved slowly enough, carried her baby on her back, and gathered plants as she went. This is one of the first things the journals note about her contribution to the expedition. Not her interpreting, not her navigation, but her plants. She knew, by sight and smell and the particular time of year, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were useful for other purposes. In a region where the expedition's food supply was dependent on hunting and fishing, variable, uncertain, sometimes scarce, her ability to supplement the diet with wild plants was immediately valuable. She found wild artichokes, cached underground by mice and ground squirrels, and showed the men how to dig them out. She found prairie turnips, breadroot, the starchy underground tubers of a plant that grew on the plains and that the expedition members had never encountered. She found fennel bulbs and licorice root and the dried berries that had survived the winter on the shrubs above the snowline. She moved through the landscape the way a person moves through their own kitchen, knowing where things were, what they were for, how to prepare them. The upper Missouri River country of Montana is one of the most dramatic landscapes in North America. A country of deep river canyons and towering white clay cliffs, of vast open plains broken by the sudden coulees and badlands formations that the river has cut through the soft sedimentary rock over millions of years. The expedition called the White Clay Formations the White Cliffs, and Lewis wrote about them with genuine literary excitement. He described them as resembling the ruins of ancient cities, cathedrals, towers, fortresses, the wind and water. Erosion of thousands of years having produced shapes that mimicked human architecture so closely that the imagination filled them with inhabitants. The White Cliffs of the Missouri. In what is now central Montana are formations of Cretaceous-age limestone and shale that have been eroded by the Missouri River into spires, columns, and arched formations that rise 60 to 80 feet above the river. Lewis's description of them as resembling ancient ruins has been echoed by every traveler who has seen them since. The area is now part of the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, one of the least visited and most spectacular landscapes. In the American West, where the river runs through a canyon largely unchanged from what Lewis and Clark saw in 1805, Sacagawea moved through this landscape with a different quality of attention than the captains brought to it. Lewis was looking at it with the eyes of a naturalist and a writer, cataloguing, describing, finding language for what he saw. Clark was looking at it with the eyes of a cartographer, measuring distances, noting landmarks, building the map that was the primary scientific product of the expedition. Sacagawea was looking at it with the eyes of someone who had crossed it once, before, as a 12-year-old captive, traveling in the opposite direction. She was looking for landmarks that matched something in her memory. The shape of a particular canyon wall, the way a creek entered the river, the configuration of hills on the horizon. She was, without anyone asking her to, navigating. She began to recognize things. In late July, near what is now the town of Three Forks, Montana, she recognized the country where she had been captured. She told the captains. She pointed out the exact spot on the river, the place where the Hidatsa raiders had surprised the Shoshone camp, the direction she had run, the place where she had been caught in the water. Lewis noted it in his journal, with his characteristic precision, adding that the information was useful because it confirmed their position on the map. They were approaching the Three Forks exactly where the map said they should be. He did not note what it must have meant to her to be back in the place of her capture, years later, traveling through it as part of an American military expedition, her baby on her back, her husband walking beside her. The journal does not record her emotions, and she, apparently, did not display them in ways that the captains noticed. She told them the information they needed and kept walking. In late June, before the Three Forks, Sacagawea fell seriously ill. The journals described the illness with some detail because it frightened both captains considerably. She had a high fever, severe abdominal pain, and intermittent delirium. She was barely able to walk. She was nursing Jean-Baptiste, and her illness was threatening his health as well. A nursing mother who cannot eat and cannot keep water down is a nursing mother whose milk will fail, and a 2-month-old infant whose milk fails will not survive long in the wilderness. The nature of Sacagawea's illness has been debated by historians. The symptoms, fever, abdominal pain, pelvic pain, are consistent with a pelvic infection following childbirth, or possibly with appendicitis, or with a urinary tract infection that had progressed to a kidney infection. Lewis treated her with what he had, Peruvian bark, which contained quinine and was effective against malaria-type fevers. Sulfur water from a nearby spring, ineffective but not harmful, and poultices of bark and herbs. By some combination of Lewis's treatments, Sacagawea's own constitution, and whatever the illness actually was running its course, she recovered within about a week. Lewis's journal entries during her illness reveal something important about how the captains had come to think of her. He wrote with genuine anxiety about her condition, not primarily with personal concern, though that is also present, but with a practical worry that is telling. If she died, he wrote, the expedition would be in serious difficulty. They were approaching the Shoshone territory. They needed an interpreter. Without her, the translation chain broke down completely. What he was saying, in the language of military expedition reports, was, "She is indispensable. She recovered." She drank the sulfur water and ate the food Lewis brought her and nursed her baby, and within a week was walking again. Within 2 weeks, she was gathering plants again, moving along the riverbanks with the efficient attention that the captains had come to rely on. She had been, by this point, traveling for approximately 3 months. She had crossed the entire state of Montana. She had been ill enough to die. She was carrying a 3-month-old baby. She kept going. The expedition reached the Three Forks of the Missouri, the place where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers converge, in late July of 1805. They named the 3 rivers after the President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Treasury, in the manner of explorers who feel entitled to name things that other people have been calling by other names for thousands of years. Sacagawea knew this place. She had been here before. This was the landscape of her capture, the country of her last Shoshone summer before the raiders came. She told the captains that the camp had been farther up the Jefferson River to the southwest. She told them that the Shoshone regularly traveled this way, that they came east to hunt bison and returned west over the mountains in late summer. The captains were in urgent need of this information. They were running out of summer, the bitter route. Mountains ahead of them were passable only in a narrow window between the snowmelt of late summer and the snowfall of early autumn, a window of perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. They needed horses. To get horses, they needed the Shoshone. To communicate with the Shoshone, they needed Sacagawea. The Jefferson River, the branch of the Missouri that Lewis and Clark followed southwest toward the mountains, is a clear, cold river that rises near the Continental Divide in what is now southwestern Montana. It runs through a valley of remarkable beauty, wide hay meadows bordered by willows, with the mountains rising on all sides. The Shoshone had used this valley for generations as an access route to the bison country of the east, crossing the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass and descending to the Three Forks area for summer hunts. Their knowledge of the route was precise and detailed. Sacagawea's memory of it from her childhood journeys was an invaluable supplement to the maps the expedition was building. Lewis pushed ahead of the main party with a small group of men trying to find the Shoshone before the season changed. He followed the Jefferson and its tributary, the Beaverhead, climbing toward the mountains, desperately scanning the horizon for sign of people. He found them on August 13th, 1805, a small group of Shoshone, 3 women and a man, on horseback, on the open plain. Lewis approached slowly, his hands open, his rifle across his back rather than in his hands. He held out trade goods, mirrors, beads, the small bright objects that signaled peaceful intent across language barriers. The Shoshone hesitated. Then one of the women came forward, and then the rest of the band arrived, 60 warriors on horseback surrounding Lewis and his 3 companions. The tension of the moment balanced on the knife edge between welcome and disaster. Lewis presented the mirrors and the beads. He painted his cheeks with vermilion, the sign of peace that the Shoshone recognized. The chief, a man named Sacagawea, embraced him in the Shoshone fashion of greeting, arms around, the neck, cheek, pressed to cheek. She tried to translate through her tears. Clark notes that she would do well for a moment, and then break down weeping again, and then collect herself and continue. Sacagawea was also moved. His sister, taken years ago, believed dead or lost forever, suddenly here, alive, with a baby, on her back, sitting in a council of strange men and speaking words in their language. There was another recognition, quieter and more painful. Among the Shoshone women present was a friend who had been captured with Sacagawea at the same time and had escaped during the raid and made her way back to the band. This woman was here, back among her people. Sacagawea was not. She was still, in some fundamental sense, far from home. "Ah, Haye," the chief said. "I am much rejoiced." Lewis, who spoke not a word of Shoshone, had no idea what he had said. He smiled and presented more beads. 4 days later, Sacagawea arrived with Clark and the main party. She had been summoned forward to help translate. Lewis had gotten Sacagawea and his band to the river camp, and the formal council was about to begin, and without her, the whole diplomatic enterprise was going nowhere. She came forward and sat down to translate, and she looked at Sacagawea, and she knew him. Clark's journal records the moment with a restraint that makes it more powerful, not less. She instantly jumped up, ran and embraced him, and threw her blanket over him and cried profusely. Sacagawea was her brother. The probability of Sacagawea recognizing her brother among the Shoshone band that Lewis and Clark encountered is worth considering. Sacagawea was the leader of the band, a position of significant status that he had clearly achieved in the years since Sacagawea's capture. When she was taken, he would have been perhaps 14 or 15 years old. She had not seen him in approximately 4 to 5 years. The band Lewis encountered was the specific Lemhi Shoshone band, the same band Sacagawea had grown up in. The geographic logic of the encounter makes the recognition possible. The Lemhi Shoshone regularly used Lemhi Pass and the upper Beaverhead area for their eastern hunting trips, and the expedition was following the exact route the Shoshone would have used. She composed herself. She translated. The council proceeded. Camawait agreed to provide horses and a guide through the mountains. She had held herself together long enough to do what was needed. Then, when the formal business was done, she sat with her brother and spoke in their language, fast and low, for the first time in years. The journals do not record what they said to each other. The crossing of the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass happened on August 12, 1805. In Lewis's account, the day before he found the Shoshone, when he and 3 companions climbed to the crest of the divide and looked west for the first time. He had expected, everyone had expected, because the prevailing geographical theory of the time suggested it, to see a relatively short descent to the Columbia River system, and from there a navigable water route to the Pacific. The theory was wrong. What Lewis saw from the top of Lemhi Pass was more mountains, ridge after ridge of the Bitterroots stretching west as far as he could see, no navigable river visible, no easy passage apparent. Lemhi Pass, at an elevation of 7,373 feet on the current Montana-Idaho border, sits precisely on the Continental Divide, the backbone of the continent from which water flows either to the Atlantic or the Pacific. Lewis climbed to the crest, expecting to see the short portage and easy descent that Jefferson's geographical theory predicted. Instead, he saw the Bitterroot Mountains, a complex of parallel ranges with no easy east-west route. His journal entry for that day is one of the most significant in the expedition. It marks the moment when the dream of an easy northwest passage was definitively ended, and when the true difficulty of what lay ahead became clear. The expedition crossed Lemhi Pass with the Shoshone horses Camawait provided in late August of 1805. Sacagawea crossed it in the opposite direction from her journey east as a captive, now heading back toward the mountains, back toward the country of her childhood, on horseback rather than on foot. She recognized the land immediately. The Lemhi Valley below, the shape of the Lemhi River, the particular configuration of the peaks. This was her homeland. This was where she had been born. She could have stayed. The expedition was heading into country she knew. Camawait offered to provide everything they needed. Horses, a guide, provisions. The captains needed her to translate a few more negotiations, to complete the transfer of horses and the hiring of a guide. After that, technically, she was free. She did not stay. Why she chose to continue with the expedition is not recorded. The journals don't ask the question because to the captains it was not a question worth asking. She was Charbonneau's wife, Charbonneau was hired, she came along. The decision was her husband's, but she continued. She crossed back over the mountains, away from her homeland, with the American soldiers heading west. She took her baby with her. She did not look back. Or if she did, the journals don't record it. The Shoshone guide provided by Camawait was an older man who the expedition called Old Toby. His actual name was not recorded in any source. That survived. He knew the route through the Bitterroots, the Lolo Trail, a high ridge route used by the Nez Perce for generations to travel between their homeland on the Columbia Plateau and the bison country of the Montana Plains. The Lolo Trail was one of the most demanding routes in North America. It ran along the ridgetops of the Bitterroots, above the tree line in places, through dense forest in others, with no reliable water sources for long stretches and no game to speak of. The high ridge country simply didn't support the large animals that the expedition depended on for food. The Lolo Trail traverses approximately 160 miles of the Bitterroot Mountains along the ridgetops between what is now Lolo, Montana, and the Waipe Prairie in Idaho. The terrain is brutal. The trail climbs and descends repeatedly, crossing ridges at elevations up to 7,000 feet, through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, over boulder fields and through snow that lingered on the north-facing slopes well into August. The Nez Perce, who used the trail regularly, could traverse it in about 5 days with loaded horses. Lewis and Clark took 11 days in September 1805, nearly losing their horses and their lives to starvation and cold in the process. The crossing of the Bitterroots in September 1805 was the most dangerous part of the entire expedition. Snow began falling on the third day. The trail became treacherous, icy, narrow, the horses struggling for footing on the steep slopes, the men slipping and falling, the temperature dropping at night to well below freezing. Food ran out. They killed and ate several of the horses. They ate tallow candles. They ate a colt they killed. Sacagawea was nursing Jean-Baptiste through this. A nursing mother requires approximately 500 calories per day, more than a non-nursing adult, just to maintain milk supply. She was not getting 500 extra calories. She was getting less food than the men around her. She was carrying a 7-month-old baby through snow and ice on a mountain trail while severely underfed. The journals don't note this specifically. She appears in the Bitterroot crossing entries primarily when she is needed to communicate something or when her foraging produces food. She found a cache of dried fish on one occasion, dried berries on another, edible roots along the trail. She kept going. The expedition kept going. On September 22, 1805, they descended from the Bitterroots onto the Waipe Prairie of Idaho and met the Nez Perce, who fed them. Several of the men immediately ate so much after the starvation of the Bitterroots that they became violently ill. Sacagawea, who understood from hard experience the wisdom of reintroducing food slowly to a starved body, apparently ate more carefully. The Nez Perce helped the expedition build canoes from the ponderosa pine trees of the Clearwater River Valley, hollowing them out by building fires inside the logs and then scraping the charred wood, a technique the expedition had not used before. And in October of 1805, they launched onto the Clearwater, which ran into the Snake, which ran into the Columbia. The current was now with them. After 18 months of fighting upstream, they were going downstream, toward the ocean, the river carrying them west with a speed that must have felt, after so many months of hard labor against the current, almost miraculous. The Columbia River. Drainage is one of the great river systems of the world. The Columbia itself rises in British Columbia and runs approximately 1,243 miles to the Pacific, draining an area of about 258,000 square miles, larger than France. Its tributaries, the Snake, the Clearwater, the Willamette, the Cowlitz, collectively drain a vast inland empire of plateau and mountain. The Columbia River in 1805 was one of the most productive salmon rivers on Earth. The Fall Chinook. Salmon run on the Columbia was an annual event of staggering biological scale. An estimated 10 to 16 million salmon entered the river each year to spawn, their bodies so numerous in the smaller tributaries that eyewitnesses described being able to walk across them. The Nez Perce, Yakima, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Columbia River Chinook peoples had built sophisticated civilizations around this resource over thousands of years, with weirs, platforms, nets, and drying racks that could process hundreds of fish per day. The construction of the Bonneville Dam in 1937 and subsequent dams on the Columbia and Snake reduced the salmon runs to a fraction of their historical abundance, a loss of biological and cultural wealth on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend. The expedition moved through the Columbia Plateau in October, stopping at village after village along the river, trading for food and information. Sacagawea's role shifted in this country. These were not Shoshone-speaking people, and Charbonneau's translation chain broke down. But her presence in the bow of the canoe had a different kind of value. Clark noticed it and recorded it specifically. The presence of a woman and a baby changed the dynamic of every encounter. A war party does not travel with women and infants. A trading party does. The sight of Sacagawea and Jean-Baptiste at the front of the canoe signaled to every village they approached that the expedition came in peace. She was, without knowing, she had been assigned the role, the expedition's most effective diplomatic tool. They heard the ocean before they saw it. In early November of 1805, approaching the coast through the wide estuary of the Lower Columbia, the expedition began to feel the swell of the Pacific in the river itself. A long, slow undulation beneath the canoes that was different from any river motion, a motion that came from thousands of miles away. And then the roaring, not the roaring of rapids, but something deeper and more continuous, a sound that came from every direction at once and did not stop. On November 7th, Clark wrote in his journal, "Great joy in camp, we are in view of the ocean. This great Pacific octane which we've been so long anxious to see." Clark's journal entry announcing the Pacific is one of the most famous sentences in American exploration history, celebrated partly for its misspellings — Clark was not a strong speller — and partly for the simple, unguarded joy it expresses. The expedition had traveled approximately 4,132 miles from Camp Dubois near St. Louis to the Pacific coast. They had been traveling for 18 months. They had crossed the entire width of the continent. Clark's ocean and octane are the spelling of a man writing fast in cold and rain, with his hand probably numb, trying to get the feeling down before the moment passed. They spent a miserable, rain-soaked winter at Fort Clatsop, south of the Columbia's mouth, in a small log fort they built themselves. The Pacific Northwest coast in winter is wet in a way that the plains and mountains had not prepared them for. Not the dry cold of the Montana winter or the dramatic snowstorms of the Bitterroots, but a constant, penetrating, grey wetness that never stopped. It rained for all but 12 days of their stay at Fort Clatsop. Sacagawea, in this wet grey winter, did something small that the journals record with characteristic understatement. She lobbied to go see the whale. A whale had beached itself south of the fort, and Clark was organizing a party to visit it and obtain as much blubber and oil as possible for the expedition's provisions. Sacagawea asked, firmly enough that Clark noted it specifically, to be included. She said she had traveled a great distance to see the ocean and had not yet seen it properly, and she very much wanted to see the great fish. Clark took her. They arrived to find the whale already stripped to bones by the Tillamook people who lived nearby. Clark traded for 300 pounds of blubber and several gallons of oil. Sacagawea saw the ocean and the whale standing on the Pacific beach with her baby on her back at the western edge of the continent. The whale that beached near the expedition's Fort Clatsop in January 1806 was estimated from its skeleton to have been approximately 105 feet long, almost certainly a blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth. Blue whales can reach lengths of up to 110 feet and weights of up to 330,000 pounds. The Tillamook people, who had already processed the whale when Clark's party arrived, had rendered the blubber for oil and removed the baleen. Clark traded beads and other goods for a portion of the blubber and oil, which the expedition used for cooking and waterproofing leather. She stood on the beach and looked at the ocean. What she thought, what she felt, whether the ocean corresponded to anything in her experience or her imagination, or whether it was simply beyond any category she possessed, the journal does not say. Clark records the visit practically: the whale, the trade, the return journey. She had been born in the mountains of Idaho. She was standing on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. Between those 2 points lay everything: the plains, the rivers, the Bitterroots, the Columbia, the years of captivity, the baby on her back, the brother she had left behind at Lemhi Pass, the width of the continent. She looked at the ocean. Then she turned around, and they went back to the fort. You are very deep now. The journey turns east. The river runs the other way. Let yourself drift with it. The expedition left Fort Clatsop on March 23, 1806, heading east. They were going home. Back up the Columbia, back over the Bitterroots, back across the plains and the Missouri, back to St. Louis. The journey had taken them to the edge of the continent, and now the continent was pulling them back. The return trip was faster in some ways and more complicated in others. They knew the route now, more or less. They had maps, rough and provisional, but real. They had the journals, the botanical specimens, the geographical observations that were the scientific harvest of the journey. They were not, as they had been, going out, moving into complete unknown, but they were also racing the season again. They needed to cross the Bitterroots before the snow closed the passes in autumn, and this time, when they reached the Shoshone country, Sacagawea was not going home. She was continuing east, back across the mountains, back to the Mandan villages, back to the life she had been living before the expedition came. The return. Journey of the Lewis and Clark expedition was approximately 3,700 miles, accomplished in approximately 156 days, significantly faster than the outward journey, partly because they knew the route and partly because they split the party at several points to explore different routes simultaneously. Lewis took a group north to explore the Marias River country, nearly disastrously. He had a violent encounter with Blackfoot warriors in which 2 Blackfoot men were killed. Clark took a group south along the Yellowstone. John Coulter, whom we met in our previous story, was on this expedition. He would leave the return party at the Mandan villages, exactly as Sacagawea and Charbonneau did. The Bitterroots, on the return, were still snowbound. They tried to cross in late May and were turned back by snow 15 feet deep on the high ridges. They waited 3 weeks on the eastern side of the mountains, staying with the Nez Perce, before a Nez Perce guide told them it was passable. The same guide led them across in 6 days, a route that had taken 11 days in the autumn. Sacagawea crossed the Bitterroots for the second time. Her son, Jean-Baptiste, was now 15 months old, strong enough to look around from his cradleboard with active curiosity, old enough to be beginning the tentative first stages of understanding the world he had been carried through since he was 55 days old. He had been born on the Missouri and had traveled to the Pacific and back. He had crossed the Continental Divide twice. He had been present at councils with Shoshone chiefs and Nez Perce headmen and Columbia River trading peoples. He had slept through rapids and rainstorms and been carried over mountain passes in snow. He had nursed through a mother's near-fatal illness and survived the starvation crossing of the Bitterroots. He was 15 months old. He had lived more than most people would live in a lifetime. They reached the Mandan villages in mid-August of 1806. Charbonneau's contract with the expedition was complete. He was paid $500 and 33 1/3 cents for his services, a substantial sum by the standards of the time. Sacagawea received nothing. She was not a party to the contract. She was Charbonneau's wife. The money was his. Clark, who had developed a genuine affection for both her and Jean-Baptiste over the 16 months of the journey, made an offer before he left. He wrote to Charbonneau. He would take the boy and raise him in St. Louis, give him a proper education, and ensure his future. The offer extended, more informally, to Sacagawea herself. She was welcome to come to St. Louis, Clark said, where he would do what he could for her. Charbonneau declined for the moment. Jean-Baptiste was too young to be weaned. But he wrote back to Clark later that year saying they would come to St. Louis when the boy was older. Clark's offer to raise Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was genuine and consequential. Jean-Baptiste did eventually come to St. Louis, arriving in 1809, when he was approximately 4 years old. Clark enrolled him in the Jesuit school in St. Louis and oversaw his education. Jean-Baptiste grew up to become one of the most remarkable men of the 19th century American West. He spoke 4 languages, English, French, Spanish, and his mother's Shoshone. Traveled to Europe in 1823 at the invitation of a German prince, lived in Europe for 6 years, returned to America and became a mountain man and guide, served as alcalde, mayor, of the San Luis Rey Mission in California, and participated in the California Gold Rush before dying in Oregon in 1866. The baby who crossed the continent on his mother's back became one of the most widely traveled men of his century. The expedition left the Mandan villages and headed downstream to St. Louis. John Coulter, who had joined the expedition at its beginning and traveled with it to the Pacific and back, peeled off at the Mandan villages and turned back upstream, beginning the solitary wandering that would eventually take him to Yellowstone. This is the point where Coulter's story and Sacagawea's story separate. The main expedition reached St. Louis on September 23, 1806, to a reception that Clark described as enthusiastic and Lewis described more briefly. They had been gone 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days. They had traveled approximately 8,000 miles. They had lost exactly 1 man, Sergeant Charles Floyd, who died of what was probably a ruptured appendix in August of 1804, before the expedition had even reached the first winter camp. It remains one of the most successful extended wilderness expeditions in human history. Sacagawea was not there when St. Louis celebrated. She was at the Mandan villages in the Earth Lodge country of the Upper Missouri with her husband and her son. Here, the story becomes uncertain. The historical record of Sacagawea after 1806 is sparse, contradictory, and vigorously debated. There are two competing versions of what happened to her, supported by different evidence and different historians. The first version: she came to St. Louis with Charbonneau and Jean-Baptiste in 1809, as Charbonneau had written to Clark. She lived there for a short time. In 1812, a clerk at Fort Manuel on the Upper Missouri, a fort that Charbonneau had gone to work at, apparently unable to settle in St. Louis, recorded the death of the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, of putrid fever. She was, he noted, about 25 years old. If this was Sacagawea, she died in December of 1812, approximately 24 years old, at a remote fur trading post on the Missouri River. The Fort Manuel death record, written by a fur company, Clark named John Luttig, is the primary evidence for Sacagawea dying in 1812. The record reads, "This evening the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of a putrid fever. She was a good and the best woman in the fort. Aged ab 25 years she left, a fine infant girl." The infant girl mentioned in the record was later taken in by Clark, who had agreed to be guardian to Charbonneau's children. Clark's subsequent guardianship records list both Tess, Baptiste, and Lisette as his wards, supporting the identification of the deceased woman as Sacagawea. Putrid fever in this context likely refers to typhoid fever or a similar systemic bacterial infection. The second version: she did not die at Fort Manuel. She returned to her Shoshone people eventually and lived to an old age on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, dying in April of 1884 at approximately 95 years old. An Agaidika Shoshone woman known as Porivo, Chief Woman, told stories consistent with Sacagawea's experiences and was identified by some Shoshone people as the returned bird woman. A grave on the Wind River Reservation is marked with a stone that says Sacagawea died April 9, 1884. The weight of historical evidence, the Fort Manuel death record, Clark's guardianship records, the internal consistency of the 1812 death, favors the early death version. Most historians accept it. But the Wind River tradition persists, maintained by Shoshone oral history, and it has its own kind of truth. The story of a woman who survived everything and came home. Perhaps that is the story that needed to be true. Very deep now. Let the facts settle around you like the first light of morning, like the slow clearing of mountain mist. One of the things that is easy to lose in the grand narrative of the expedition, the maps, the miles, the mountain crossings, the diplomatic encounters, is the specific quality of what Sacagawea did when she translated. Translation is not a mechanical process. It is not the replacement of one word with another word. Every language is a different way of organizing the world, a different set of categories for experience, a different relationship between sound and meaning. When you translate between languages as different as Shoshone and Hidatsa and French and English, languages from entirely different language families, with different grammatical structures, different ways of indicating time and relationship, and emphasis, you are not moving words from one bucket to another. You are rebuilding meaning from the ground up, in a new structure, for a new audience. The Shoshone language is a polysynthetic language. It builds complex meanings by combining many elements into single long words, rather than using separate words and particles as English does. A single Shoshone word can encode information that would require an entire English sentence to convey. Who is doing the action? Who is affected by it? When it happens? What the relationship is between the speaker and the subject, and the speaker's certainty about what they are describing. Translating from this kind of language into the more analytical structure of French and then English requires not just linguistic skill, but a sophisticated understanding of what the speaker is trying to communicate at the level of meaning, not just words. Sacagawea did this translation work through the four-language chain, simultaneously understanding what was being said in Shoshone and reformulating it in Hidatsa in a way that preserved its meaning, while nursing a baby, while walking or paddling or riding, while managing the 1,000 small practical tasks of wilderness travel. She did it without preparation, without dictionaries or grammar books, relying entirely on the languages that lived in her. She spoke Shoshone from birth. She learned Hidatsa during her years of captivity, an immersive, total acquisition that produced apparently near-native fluency. She may have picked up some French from her husband and some English from the expedition members. She operated simultaneously in at least 2 languages, and possibly more throughout the journey. The cognitive load of this is not trivial. Simultaneous translation is considered one of the most demanding mental tasks a human being can perform. Professional conference interpreters work in 30-minute shifts and rotate frequently because the concentration required is so intense. Sacagawea performed a version of it continuously over 16 months without a break. Throughout the journals, scattered through hundreds of entries, is a running botanical catalogue that is largely Sacagawea's. Wild artichokes, cached by rodents in underground chambers. Prairie turnips, the starchy breadroot that was a staple food of the plains tribes and that the expedition learned to rely on in the lean stretches between game. Wild licorice root, wild fennel bulbs, service berries and chokecherries and bull berries. Kama's roots, correctly identified as edible kamas rather than the deadly white kamas that looked almost identical. Ground plums, wild ginger, the dried berries that survived the winter on the shrubs and provided sugar and calories when nothing else was available. Camas, Camassia quamash, is a flowering plant of the lily family that grows in moist mountain meadows from British Columbia to California. Its bulb, about the size of a small onion, has a sweet, starchy flavor when cooked and was one of the most important food sources for many Western native peoples. The confusion between blue kamas, edible, and white kamas, or death kamas, Anticlea elegans, highly toxic, was a genuine survival risk. The 2 plants look nearly identical before flowering, and their bulbs are nearly indistinguishable to the untrained eye. Death kamas contains toxic alkaloids that cause cardiac arrest. There is no antidote. Sacagawea's ability to reliably distinguish them was not a minor skill. The plants she identified and gathered over 16 months of travel provided the expedition with food in moments when the hunting had failed, with medicinal remedies when people were sick, and with materials for practical tasks, bark for lashing, roots for weaving, plants whose properties she knew and whose uses she taught to the expedition members who were willing to learn. None of this appears in the summary accounts of the expedition. It appears in the journals, in scattered entries as small practical facts. Sacagawea found some roots today. The Indian woman gathered artichokes. She recognized these berries as edible. The cumulative weight of these small entries is a picture of someone who moved through every landscape the expedition crossed as through a living pantry, knowing what was available and how to use it. This is the knowledge that takes generations to accumulate. The knowledge of people who have lived in a landscape long enough to have tested every plant, remembered what worked and what killed, and passed that knowledge down through generations of women teaching daughters. It is not dramatic knowledge. It does not make good headlines, but it is the knowledge that keeps people alive. Perhaps the most underappreciated of Sacagawea's contributions to the expedition is the one that is hardest to document precisely: her ability to read the landscape. She had grown up in the mountains, on one side of the Continental Divide, and been taken across to the other side. She had traveled, as a captive, through approximately 500 miles of the northern plains and mountains. She had survived in that landscape for 4 or 5 years before the expedition arrived, and she had the particular kind of geographical memory that comes from growing up in a place. The memory that lives in the body as much as in the mind, that registers the slope of a hillside and the curve of a river and the shape of a peak against the sky as information about where you are and where you can go. The Shoshone had been navigating the Rocky Mountain landscape for thousands of years and had developed sophisticated geographical knowledge that was encoded in their language, their stories, and their seasonal movements. Place names in Shoshone often describe the geographic character of a location in detail. A particular mountain might be named for the way its shadow fell at a certain time of year, or a river for the sound it made at a particular crossing, or a pass for the specific wind that blew through it. This verbal mapping of landscape was a form of navigation that allowed people to describe routes to others who had never been there, using names that carried their own geographical information. Near the Three Forks of the Missouri, she recognized the country of her capture and gave the captains information that confirmed their position on the map. Near Lemhi Pass, her recognition of the Lemhi River Valley, the specific shape of the mountains, the lay of the land, guided the expedition to the Shoshone camp where the horses and the guide were waiting. She pointed out Beaverhead Rock, a large, distinctive limestone formation on the Beaverhead River in Montana, as a landmark known to the Shoshone, a place her people used as a navigation marker on their eastern hunting trips. This recognition allowed Lewis and Clark to confirm that they were on the right river and that the Shoshone were likely nearby. Small things, practical things, the kind of thing that doesn't make it into the dramatic retellings, the monument speeches, the commemorative coins, the school textbooks with their simplified narratives. But these small practical moments of recognition and knowledge were the moments when the expedition found its way rather than losing it. There is another figure in the Corps of Discovery who deserves more space than history has usually given him, and who moved through the same landscapes as Sacagawea with a different burden and a different story. York was William Clark's enslaved servant. He had been with Clark since childhood. Clark had inherited him from his father, and he made the entire journey to the Pacific and back. He was probably in his early 30s during the expedition, a large, powerful man whose physical presence and unfamiliar appearance made a strong impression on every native people the expedition encountered. York, c. 1770, c. 1832, was an enslaved African-American man who accompanied William Clark on the Lewis and Clark expedition as his personal servant. York is mentioned in the journals over 100 times, primarily in the context of the reaction he provoked among native peoples who had never seen a black man. Many tried to rub off what they assumed was paint. Some considered him a powerful spiritual being, and the Hidatsa in particular showed him great interest. York participated in all the hardships of the expedition and was, by the evidence of the journals, a capable and contributing member of the party. He was, unlike every other adult male member of the expedition, given no pay, no land grant, and no recognition upon return. He asked Clark for his freedom after the expedition and was refused. Clark eventually freed him sometime around 1811, though the exact date is uncertain. York voted. On November 24, 1805, with the expedition camped near the Pacific coast trying to decide where to spend the winter, Lewis and Clark held a vote on the location of the winter camp. Every member of the party was given a vote, including York, including Sacagawea. This was, as far as the historical record shows, the first time a black American man and a Native American woman both voted in a formal decision-making process in American history. It was 1805. Women would not get the right to vote in federal elections for another 115 years. Black men would not get the right to vote under federal law for another 65 years. The Civil Rights Act that would protect that right in practice would not come for another 159 years. In a tent on the Oregon coast in November of 1805, it happened anyway. Clark recorded it without comment, as a practical matter of group decision-making in a difficult situation. Neither York nor Sacagawea is recorded as having expressed any sense of the historical significance of the moment. They simply voted. Clark recorded the results, and they moved on. Almost there. The mountains are behind you. Let the river carry you home. Let the story settle into sleep. The Lewis and Clark expedition returned to St. Louis in September 1806 to enormous public celebration. Lewis and Clark were heroes. Their journals, when published in 1814, became foundational texts of American exploration. The maps they produced, incorporating the geographical knowledge of hundreds of native informants, including Sacagawea, were the most accurate representation of the American West available for the next several decades. Sacagawea's contribution to those maps, to those journals, to the success of the expedition, all of this was present in the record. It just wasn't named. The plants she found were catalogued but not attributed. The landmarks she identified were noted but not credited. The translation work she performed was described functionally but not analyzed. The four-language chain through which diplomatic relationships were built and sustained was mentioned but not celebrated. She was there on every page, doing the work, carrying the baby, moving through the landscape with her particular quality of attention. And she was also, in the narrative structure of the journals, largely invisible. The rehabilitation of Sacagawea's historical reputation began seriously in the late 19th century, driven partly by the women's suffrage movement, which adopted her as a symbol of women's capability and contribution. Suffragist Ava Emery Dye's 1902 novel The Conquest, which romanticized Sacagawea's role in the expedition, brought her to wide popular attention. Statues of her were erected at the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Portland in 1905, and she became, over the course of the 20th century, one of the most memorialized women in American history, her image appearing on monuments in more states than any other American woman. The golden dollar coin bearing her image was introduced in 2000. The memorialization is real and deserved, but it has also inevitably simplified her. The coin shows a young woman looking forward with calm assurance, her baby visible on her back. A heroic image, clean and resolved. The reality was a girl who had been taken from her family at 12, who traveled 8,000 miles in a year and a half under conditions that would have stopped most professional soldiers, who did work that no one else on the expedition could do, and who received neither pay nor credit for it in her own time. She was extraordinary. She was also a person in a situation not of her choosing, doing what she needed to do to survive and to help the people she was with survive. These two things are not in conflict. They are, in fact, the same thing. Her son lived. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Pomp, grew up in St. Louis under Clark's guardianship, attended the Jesuit school, became literate in English and French. In 1823, at the age of 18, he met a German prince named Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg, who was touring the American West with scientific and exploratory purposes. Paul Wilhelm was charmed by the young man's intelligence and linguistic ability and invited him to Europe. Jean-Baptiste went. He lived in Europe for 6 years, primarily in Germany, but traveling widely, and learned Spanish and apparently some German as well. He returned to America in 1829 with 4 languages and a European education, and he went straight back to the mountains. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, 1805-1866, became a fur trapper and guide in the Rocky Mountain country that his mother had helped to map. He worked as a guide for numerous scientific and military expeditions, including those of John C. Fremont. He was present at the famous annual Mountain Man Rendezvous of the 1830s and 1840s, the same gatherings that figure in our earlier stories. He served as alcalde of Mission San Luis Rey in California from 1847 to 1848 during the period of American military occupation following the Mexican-American War. He participated in the California Gold Rush. He died in Oregon in 1866 at the age of 61, while traveling to the mining camps of Montana. Still moving, still heading into new country, 61 years after his mother had carried him across the continent on her back. He was the last living member of the Corps of Discovery. He died in 1866 when the Transcontinental Railroad was under construction and the Plains-Indian Wars were beginning, a world so transformed from the one his mother had moved through that the mountains and rivers she had navigated were barely recognizable under their new names and their new roads and their new settlers. He had been born at Fort Mandan. He died in Oregon. He had traveled, in 61 years of life, across essentially the entire continent that his mother had crossed in his first year of life, on her back, in a cradleboard, at a pace of perhaps 15 miles a day. He was the thing she left behind that the world kept. The Lemhi Shoshone homeland, the valley where Sacagawea was born, the mountains where she grew up, the river her people had fished for generations, is today a landscape of remarkable beauty and considerable complexity. The Lemhi Valley is in Custer County, Idaho, a long, narrow valley surrounded by mountains, the Lemhi River running through it. The valley floor is ranching country now, hay meadows and cattle, the same general vegetation but managed differently. The mountains above are the Salmon River Mountains and the Lemhi Range, largely unchanged from what they were in 1788. The Beaverhead Mountains to the east, with Lemhi Pass on their crest, are now managed by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. The Lemhi Shoshone were removed from their homeland in 1907, when the Lemhi Reservation, established by treaty in 1868, was terminated and the people were relocated to the Fort Hall Reservation near Pocatello, Idaho, over 200 miles away. The removal was resisted. Some Lemhi Shoshone individuals and families refused to go and remained in the valley for years. The Lemhi Shoshone people today are part of the Shoshone Bannock tribes of the Fort Hall Reservation, and they maintain their tribal identity, language programs, and cultural practices, including their connection to the Lemhi Valley. Efforts to restore some land to the Lemhi Shoshone have been ongoing for decades. The salmon no longer run in the Lemhi River in the numbers Sacagawea knew. The Snake River dams, 8 major dams on the lower Snake, block the migration of Chinook salmon from the Pacific to the upper Snake system, of which the Lemhi is a tributary. Some salmon do make it through, using fish ladders on the dams. But the great runs of Sacagawea's childhood, the river full of fish, the weirs full, the racks full of drying salmon, are gone. The Kama's meadows still bloom blue, in the mountain valleys in June. The service berries still ripen in August. The choke cherries still hang dark and tart in September, ready for drying. The mountains still look the same in the afternoon light that Sacagawea saw every day of her childhood. She would recognize the mountains, the Missouri River. The river Sacagawea traveled up and then down, covering approximately 3,000 miles of its length in the course of the expedition, is today one of the most dammed and channelized rivers in North America. 6 large dams on the Missouri, Fort Peck, Garrison, Oahe, Big Bend, Fort Randall, and Gavin's Point, have converted much of the river's upper reaches into a series of reservoirs. The river that Lewis and Clark traveled was braided and shallow in places, deep and turbulent in others, lined with cottonwood forests and sandbars and the dense riparian vegetation that supported an extraordinary abundance of wildlife. Many of those sandbars are now under reservoirs. Many of those cottonwood forests are gone. The Missouri River before damming was one of the most biologically productive river systems in North America. It supported vast populations of paddlefish, pallid sturgeon, which can live over 100 years and reach 6 feet in length, and dozens of other fish species. Its floodplain supported the largest cottonwood forests on the Great Plains, which, in turn, supported enormous populations of migratory birds. The 6 dams built between 1933 and 1966 eliminated the annual floods that maintained this ecosystem, converted 1,500 miles of free-flowing river to slack water, and caused the collapse of most native fish populations. The pallid sturgeon, the species that Sacagawea would have seen in the river, a living fossil that has existed largely unchanged for 70 million years, is now critically endangered. But the river still runs. In its upper reaches, above Fort Peck Dam, and in the Missouri River breaks in central Montana, the White Cliffs country that Lewis described as resembling ancient ruins, the river is still largely free-flowing, still wild, still moving. Through the landscape, with something of the character it had in 1805, you can canoe it in those stretches. You can camp on the sandbars and look at the White Cliffs and hear the same silence that Lewis heard when he was moved to write poetry and Sacagawea was moved to gather breadroot. The river remembers what happened on it. Rest now. We are almost home. Let the last of the story come like water finding still ground. The golden dollar coin that bears Sacagawea's image was introduced on January 27, 2000. It is legal tender. It buys things. It passes through thousands of hands every day, without most of those hands knowing whose face they are holding or what she did. The woman who designed the image, a sculptor named Glenna Goodacre, used a young Shoshone woman named Randiel Hidao Teton as the model for Sacagawea's face. Teton was a student at the University of New Mexico when she was selected. She has Shoshone ancestry on her father's side. The coin shows Sacagawea in profile, looking to the left, forward, from the perspective of a right-handed person reading text that runs left to right. She is looking into the future. Her baby is on her back, visible as a small shape behind her shoulder. Her hair is pulled back. Her expression is calm and directed. Around the edge of the coin, Sacagawea, Liberty, 2000. Liberty is a complicated word for her story. She was not, for most of her life, free in any conventional sense. She was captured, sold, married without. Her recorded consent, hired without being consulted, paid nothing for the work she did that made the expedition possible. She traveled 8,000 miles and received no land grant, no army pay, no public recognition during her lifetime. And yet, she moved through the world with a quality that the men around her consistently noted, even when they didn't fully understand it. A self-possession, a competence, a calm that did not come from the absence of difficulty, but from something deeper than difficulty could reach. She was a captive who became indispensable, a child who became, without intending to, one of the most important figures in the history of the American West. She carried her son across the continent and back. He lived to be 61 years old and saw the world transformed beyond what either of them could have imagined. She gathered plants in every landscape she crossed, knowing what the land offered because she had been taught by women who had been taught by women who knew before them, the knowledge going back into a depth of time that no written record reaches. She translated between languages, between peoples, between worlds that did not share a common vocabulary for what mattered, with a patience and a skill that held the expedition together at the moments when it most needed holding. She stood on the shore of the Pacific Ocean and looked at the largest body of water on Earth with her baby on her back, and then turned around and walked home. The last night on the river, and now let go. Let the river carry you. The current is slow and warm. The stars are very bright above the water. Imagine her in the last days of the journey back, on the Missouri River somewhere in what is now North Dakota, late August of 1806. The river is wide here, moving slow and brown through the cottonwood flats. The banks are lined with the gold green of late summer willows. The air smells of river mud and cottonwood, and the particular sweet, sharp smell of prairie grass in August, when the grasses have seeded and dried, and the whole plain smells like bread. Jean-Baptiste is asleep in his cradleboard, propped against a pack in the bow of the canoe, his face turned to the side, his dark eyes closed. He is 16 months old. He has grown enormously on the journey, the long-limbed, solid growth of a healthy baby who has been carried everywhere and held always, and has never wanted for warmth or contact. Sacagawea is paddling in the stern. The men on shore are tracking the canoe along a difficult stretch, pulling it with ropes around a bend where the current runs too strong to paddle against. She is managing the stern sweep, keeping the bow pointed downstream, letting the rope tension and the current work together. She has been doing this for 16 months. The paddle in her hands is as familiar as breathing. Ahead, around the bend, are the Mandan villages. The journey ends there for her. Charbonneau will collect his pay. Clark will say goodbye. The main party will continue downstream to St. Louis, to the newspapers and the speeches and the banquets and the history books. She will stay. The canoe comes around the bend, and the Mandan villages appear on the bluff above the river. The earth lodges dark against the sky, the smoke of evening fires rising, the horses moving in the fields below the village. She knows this place. She spent 4 or 5 years here, years that were not her choice, but that were hers nonetheless. She looks at the villages. She looks at her sleeping son. She thinks, maybe, of her brother Camiawait, still in the mountains to the west, leading his band through the seasons of hunting and fishing that she grew up with and left and may never return to. She thinks of the mountains themselves, the particular quality of the light in the Lemhi Valley in late afternoon, the sound the river made at the crossing near the winter camp, the smell of the high meadows in July. She thinks of all the country between here and there. All the country she has now moved through in 2 directions. All the water she has crossed. The canoe grounds softly on the bank below the Mandan villages. Voices call down from above. Jean-Baptiste stirs and opens his eyes. She lifts him from the cradleboard and holds him against her chest and looks at the river moving past. Still moving, the Missouri always moving, carrying whatever it carries downstream toward the sea. She too holds her son. The river moves. The mountains are far to the west, still there, always there, holding the light. Rest now. The river is carrying you. The current is slow and warm. The cottonwoods are golden on the bank. The baby is sleeping. The mountains are behind you, still lit with the last of the day. She carried everything across and back and kept going. You can rest now. Sleep. The river remembers everything.